Encounter is brought to you by the Broome County Council of Churches, where we connect compassion with needs as we inspire growth with dignity. You'll find us in special places throughout the community. For those who remain hungry, we provide meals. For those who are challenged, we build wheelchair ramps. We comfort those who are ill, minister to those who are confined, and we remain an advocate for change and understanding on behalf of every element of our community. Connect and inspire. Encounter the Broome County Council of Churches.
Good morning. I'm Jeff Kellam, the Parish Associate at the Union Presbyterian Church. Welcome to this week's edition of Encounter. Jerry Seinfeld has this streaming program on the internet called Comedians in Cars Getting Coffee. And basically the format is he chooses a really neat car, a classic MG or maybe a really spiffy Lincoln Navigator or something. And he goes to pick up a comedian friend of his at their home or at their club or whatever, and then they go out and get coffee together. And their conversation begins with the car, and then it moves to comedy. What makes comedy, and what brought you into being a comedian and so on? Well, it occurred to me that it'd be really fun to have a program called Clergy in Cars Getting Coffee, where I could get a car and go pick up a clergy person at their church, and then we just talk, whether it's a rabbi, a priest, or a minister. But I don't have the budget for that. I don't have a car. I don't have a coffee. But I got a priest. So Father Michael Galuppi is my guest today. He is are you the priest in charge or the pastor?
The pastor.
Pastor of both St. Ambrose Church in the heart of Endicott on Washington Avenue, and also Our Lady of Good Counsel Church, which is at the corner of Griffin and is it still West Main Street?
Yes.
Okay. So as the priest there, and as the Protestant Presbyterian pastor, so alliterative. And our roles are so alliterative. If you think of pastor, priest, preacher, and maybe prophetic, there must be a prophetic role to what we do, whatever our tradition. Now the term preacher, I'm used to that. I don't like the term because it sounds so finger-waggy and Bible thumping and hortative. Catholic priests aren't really, use that term preacher. Right?
We don't use it so much, but if you read what the church says that the main role of the pastor is, it's to bring the word to the people.
Yeah.
And it is to bring the word alive and into their everyday lives.
Yeah.
The same word that Jesus preached 2,000 years ago.
So proclaiming the gospel is a central role of the priest. Priest is that liturgical role of
right.
leading the Mass, but within the Mass comes the homily, which some of us call sermons, some call meditations. I think technically in the Presbyterian order of worship is this proclamation of the word. And that's a central role and takes a little bit of time. You don't wing
Absolutely.
it, do you? You don't wing it.
If I can help it, I don't wing it. I don't want to presume on the Holy Spirit every week.
Yeah, and you don't go to the internet and say, oh, there's a good sermon, I could use that one. I remember in previous days, a minister that I knew got in serious trouble because he preached someone else's sermon without any attribution, and it was... it created a lot of issues of trust and so on. So this idea of shaping a sermon or a homily, when do you begin that process? Like Sunday, how many days ahead? Or
Well, I try to look at the scriptures on Monday.
Yeah.
And then let it ruminate for 2 or 3 days. Now, I need to, even though I don't read my homilies, I need to write them down. And that really is when when I can start putting things on the page and bouncing them off myself, see how they sound. But,
yes.
Once I get the scriptures on Monday, then I try to reflect it back to what's going on in the news this week. What have I been hearing from folks, either, who come into the office or in the confessional? What are people struggling with? What's going on in the community? So that I can, interweave that. What's going on in the arts? What's happening in entertainment?
Yeah.
Because all of that is a great stepping point into the message.
Sure, and it helps the congregation identify because they are reading the headlines. They're watching the programs, listening to the music, seeing the films, and so on.
Yeah.
We share, I think, our common tradition is a lectionary.
Yes.
And that term, the lections, I guess, the common lectionary would include something from the Hebrew Scriptures, a gospel lesson, a psalm, and an epistle. Now that varies a little bit now and then according to the season.
Right, yeah.
As we move into the Advent Christmas season, do you find yourself moving toward the Gospels more, or?
We get so many beautiful readings from the book of the prophet Isaiah about, what God is doing.
Yeah.
And the root of Jesse, the buds shall blossom.
Yeah.
I find that in Advent, we kind of move from Jesus saying "watch," and then we go into John the Baptist and Mary, and then we get Christmas.
Yes.
I find that I don't really hone in on one or the other. I read them through and see what jumps out at me.
Yeah.
And usually a word or a phrase.
And the difficulty, I think, is that some of these readings are the same every single year. You're always going to have Luke's story and
right.
Matthew's gospel. And so how do you find something fresh?
Well, I try to remember what I said last year so I don't repeat it. But it's constantly looking at a different angle.
Yeah.
And picking out something that, I hope the common passerby wouldn't normally pick up so that I can, keep it new.
Yeah, yeah. You mentioned Mary, and Mary's Magnificat is kind of the central focus of one of the Sundays in Advent. And in terms of headlines and the mighty falling and the humble being lifted up, this is powerful stuff.
It
today.
is, yeah. It was politically edgy back then, and it can be politically edgy today.
Yeah, yeah. That which is, I think, part of the prophetic role of the preaching experience.
Yeah.
So you engage yourself critically and looking for inspiration early in the week, Monday.
Yep.
Let it ruminate for a little while.
Yeah, things I don't really understand, I pick up a commentary and see what did that word mean in Hebrew, what did it mean in Greek, what did it mean to the hearers back then.
Yes.
And I do talk to or listen to or read, various other preachers, not so much to steal their ideas, but maybe they're looking at a different angle that I've completely missed.
Sure.
And I figure if the Holy Spirit is inspiring them, then we're all working for the same the same guy.
Right, right. Yeah. Yes. So the terms exegesis and eisegesis. Exegesis is where you take the scriptures and let that speak to you. Eisegesis, isn't that kind of like
I read my own ideas into the scripture.
Yeah,
yes.
yeah. I think I'm going to preach on forgiveness, so I'm going to go looking for something about forgiveness here, and so pardon the expression, but the more legitimate way to faithfully preach the scriptures is to start there with the ancient texts, and then to
uncover the heart of God.
Wonderful way
in that.
Yeah, and so you then get to kind of midweek, and you've kind of focused now your own thoughts, and then you start shaping that. Now, I remember growing up, a Protestant sermon could be 25 to 35 minutes long, and I'm sure there are others who go longer.
I would probably be thrown out of church if I tried to preach that long, unless I was in an African American community, which I was once, and they really want you to expand.
Yes.
And go 35, 40 minutes, and you're kind of circling and building to this crescendo, and
yes.
it really is a beautiful thing to watch. But,
yes.
But in typical circles, I try to go anywhere from 7 to 12, maybe 15 minutes.
Right.
Max. In Catholic circles, at least from what I've read, there's a difference between sermon and homily. Sermon, I can pick any topic that I'd like to preach on, whereas homily necessarily comes from the readings. It's an explanation or a building from the scriptures that have been presented.
Yeah, I never heard that distinction. Yeah. So your in your church bulletin or your order of worship, would be called a sermon or a
homily?
A homily. Okay.
Yep.
Okay.
Unless one week I wanted to talk about social justice that may have had nothing to do with the readings in general.
Yes.
But I need to preach a particular topic. But what we're asked to do is a homily.
Yeah.
That the scriptures really need to come alive.
And do you shape this in the form of 3 points in a poem or?
Well, 3 points are helpful, at least for me.
Yeah.
In the beginning, I used to write it out and read it. And the priest said to me, he says, you know it so well, you don't need to read it. Why do you do that? I said, what if I can't remember it? He said, if you can't remember it, how are they supposed to remember it? So he said, just simplify the message so that you can remember it. If you can remember it, chances are they'll be able to remember it too throughout the week. I thought that was great advice.
Yeah, it is good advice. We don't have teleprompters in churches.
No.
Yet.
Right.
We have, many churches now have screens and so on. In fact, that's preaching and shaping homilies and sermons, whether they are 10 minutes or 20 minutes, it's one of the few times in our culture that someone sits and listens to a speaker for that long without some sort of media enlightenment or intrusion, depending on how well it's done.
Yeah.
You don't use PowerPoint, do you, in your church?
No. And it is a powerful moment when you realize they're listening, when it's so silent in there, and you think, wow, they're really hanging onto these words.
Yeah.
And with the 2 churches and 4, sometimes 5 services on a weekend, that's 1,400 individuals.
Yeah.
That's a lot of people to speak to one-on-one on a weekly basis.
Yes.
So I take it very seriously, But I try to be creative too, because if you start out by saying in today's gospel, it's almost as though the ears just shut up. But if I start with something that's completely odd, completely strange, and they have to say, where is he going with this?
Yes, right.
Then I can tuck a message in there without them even knowing.
Yeah. If you happen to be at St. Ambrose or Our Lady of Good Counsel, you're hearing inside information now that probably you should keep to yourself. We're opening up some secrets here. Do you ever do a first-person sermon? Do you ever pretend you're someone else?
I have.
Yeah.
Yeah, on every few years, the feast of Saints Peter and Paul fall on a Sunday.
Yeah.
So I set up 2 benches, and I sit in one, and I'm St. Peter, and then when I tell my life story and how I met Christ and why I followed him, then I switch over to the other bench and then I'm St. Paul for the next few minutes.
Wonderful.
That's been fun.
Yes, yeah. Well, and it opens up a sense of variety for the congregation. It's, pardon the expression, but sometimes we are allowed to be entertaining.
Oh yeah, humor really. I think God's got a great sense of humor, so
Yeah.
we might as well also.
Right. Last week, our host had a comedian as the guest for the program, talking about the humor that we really need to hold on to and kind of remember that joy is part of praise. And I think any laughter that we have that's honest and sincere is just, a prayer.
Yeah.
When you were talking about shaping sermons and writing them down, but then kind of memorizing at least the flow and the points. I too write the sermon word for word because I find, first of all, I like to write. And I love my big old fat thesaurus is there because I like to find new ways to express, and I like to use fresh words. I have the manuscript with me, and because I think I've worked really hard on that sentence. I want it to come out the way it did, without too many hesitations. But there are so many different ways now to do this, and the main thing is to engage the congregation. And when you don't have the media behind you, a slide or a movie or something, people are hanging on words. I remember once, in terms of getting people's attention or wondering if you have it, because there is always that person asleep over here, and then a couple of children are doing something, coloring or something. And I remember once a minister who mentioned Luke Skywalker in the sermon, and I saw 4 heads pop up. So the kids didn't appear to be listening, but they were. But they're pretty good at multitasking. So that was a cue that tying in with the popular culture and making a reference to a film or a best-selling book is a way to enrich the proclamation.
A band or a song.
Yes, yeah.
I somehow found a way to tie Pink Floyd into a sermon a few years ago, and someone just brought that up to me a few weeks ago.
Is that right?
They remembered that.
They remembered it, yeah. And that's always helpful, too.
Yeah.
Our guest today is Father Michael Galuppi, who is the priest at Our Lady of Good Counsel Church in West Endicott, and also at St. Ambrose Church on Washington Avenue in Endicott. So then, toward the end of the week, you're starting to sharpen that sermon up. Now let's move back to the present time right now as you look forward to Sunday. As you get closer and closer, do you get those times when you get kind of a block and you think, this isn't working?
Well, that's why I try to plan early, because I don't think I work well under pressure. So if it's, Saturday, 2 o'clock, and I don't think it's my best work. But that's funny. Sometimes I think I've crafted a beautiful homily, and it's powerful and meaningful, and I don't get a ton of comments on the end of the week. And sometimes I think, I didn't like that at all.
Yeah.
But people really resonate. So that's where I know the Holy Spirit's in charge.
Yep. When you think that you've had a C sermon, and for someone else, though, it was an A+. And then there are other times, as you say, you think, this is a masterpiece. Boy, this is gonna, and then everybody walks out and says, have a nice week, Father.
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
The themes of the Advent Christmas season, and it's particularly Christmas now, what would be the central focus for you in this age-old story, the humble birth in a stable, in a time when humility is not really valued, the birth of the Prince of Peace, when peacemaking and peacekeeping are not particularly valued? How do you shape a homily that speaks to that?
Well, Jesus was certainly born into an atmosphere of conflict, political conflict, social conflict.
Yeah.
And I just think that all of the details of that birth, none of it went according to anybody's plan other than God's plan.
Yeah.
And to see in all of those opportunities, the way in which God can take our own shortcomings and unfulfilled plans and turn them into something that's beautiful and life-giving and healing.
Right.
I love the sort of it's lost in English, but the edgy language that Luke uses, and you can tell that he's resonating with, the emperor being, in his terms, the Prince of Peace, the King of Kings, and here this child slips in almost behind enemy lines. To be the true King of Kings, and the true Prince of Peace.
Yeah. And then is forced to flee because of the violence.
Yes, a refugee.
Yeah, he becomes a refugee. So his parents are homeless, at least temporarily.
Yeah.
And then they become refugees. The story is just rich with ways to connect with folks who may not be part of our suburban cultures, but and trying to see this story through the eyes of people in other places who are also refugees, who are also homeless. Just think of this story being told in a refugee camp. I mean, it would resonate so powerfully.
It would, yeah.